In this world, nothing can be said to be certain except death and taxes, as Benjamin Franklin once wisely noted. However, since the beginning of recorded history, there's been another phenomenon consistently observed across the face of the planet: war. The summer of 2025 marks the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II, the last major confrontation that affected the entire world. An estimated 70 to 85 million people died during that war, making it the deadliest conflict in human history. However, while the world has lived through relatively peaceful times since it ended, a staggering 231 million people are still estimated to have died as a result of battles since then. And unfortunately, the next major flare-up appears to be closer than ever. Global conflicts have doubled over the past 5 years, with 50 countries currently involved in active conflict, and many more potential conflicts simmering, just waiting for a spark to bring them to the boil. So let's take a look at the 5 most dangerous hotspots in the world today, where the threat of a world war erupting looms largest. We'll start with a conflict that, while it may have stepped back from the brink of all-out war, it still poses the greatest danger of becoming something much bigger: India versus China. Like many of the conflicts on our list, and indeed like the majority of conflicts currently active in the world, the spark between India and China was ignited by a territorial or border dispute. There are currently at least 150 territorial and border disputes globally, spread right across the planet from Antarctica to the Arctic, and remote Pacific atolls to the rolling steppes of Central Asia. The root cause of most of them can be traced back to the end of the colonial era, when Britain and France carved up half the world by drawing lines on maps. The modern borders of the Middle East, 80% of the borders of Africa, large swathes of Asia after the independence of the British Raj and French Indochina, and the borders of Europe after World War I were all largely drawn up in this way. That's at the heart of the China-India border dispute too. Both nations are nuclear powers, have the world's largest and second largest populations, and are ranked as the third and fourth most powerful militaries in the world. So a full-scale clash between them will likely quickly escalate into something really nasty. The controversy dates back to the Simla Convention of 1914, signed between Britain and Tibet, which resulted in a border running through the Himalayas, dubbed the McMahon Line, after the Foreign Secretary of the British Indian government, Henry McMahon. He was the driving force behind the creation of the border, but China wasn't a party to that agreement, and ever since it established formal relations with India in 1950 and annexed Tibet in the same year, it's disputed the border, arguing that Tibet lacked the sovereign power to sign the convention. As a result, an ongoing unresolved dispute has developed, with China controlling around 15,000 square miles of territory to the west of the line of actual control that India claims, and India administering about 34,750 square miles to the east that Beijing considers part of its territory. Tensions heightened in the late 1950s and flared up into a full-scale conflict in 1962, which lasted a month and left several thousand dead on both sides. At the end of the conflict, China drew up a so-called line of actual control, or LAC, entrenching its advances. Further fighting in 1967 killed several hundred troops on both sides, but another clash was narrowly averted in the 1980s when China misread an Indian military exercise as a possible attack. However, except for a skirmish in the Galvan Valley in 2020, which resulted in the deaths of 20 Indian and between 4 and 43 Chinese soldiers, the LAC has for the most part held. In fact, subsequent to the Galvan Valley clash, relations between China and India have thawed considerably, including a 2024 agreement on the main friction points in the Ladakh region, the restoration of direct flights, and the easing of visa restrictions, which enabled Indian pilgrims to visit sacred sites in Tibet after a 6-year gap. Both are founding members of the BRICS economic bloc, and on August 31, 2025, Chinese President Xi Jinping and Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi pledged to resolve their long-standing border differences during Modi's first state visit to China since the 2020 clash. On the face of it, the conciliatory moves in recent years signal that the chances of conflict between these two powers are receding, not increasing. However, the situation is complicated by growing political upheaval in neighboring countries where the two nations often have competing interests. Nepal and Bangladesh have both seen their governments overthrown by populist uprisings in the past year, while Myanmar remains locked in a seemingly permanent civil war. With temperatures and bloodlust rising across the region, there are simply too many potential destabilizing factors to count out another clash between India and China in the near future, especially if you consider Chinese deep involvement in the second looming conflict on our list: India versus Pakistan. Again, the root cause of the dispute is British-drawn lines on maps, specifically the original British partition in 1947, which created a Hindu-majority India and a Muslim-majority Pakistan out of UK's former colony. However, in this case, unlike the dispute between India and China, a strong case can be made that the two nations' populations, for the most part, genuinely despise each other. Skirmishes have arisen ever since the British carved up the Raj, including wars in 1965 and 1971, the latter of which resulted in a new line of control between Indian Kashmir and Pakistani Kashmir, the main disputed region. More recently, the countries clashed in 1999, but have generally kept the peace since 2003, even as sporadic low-level border fighting has killed dozens. India continues to complain, with good reason, that Pakistan supports terrorist activities on Indian soil. In 2025, tension spilled over, and the world held its breath as the two nations traded destructive missile and drone barrages and their air forces faced off in the skies. The trigger was a terrorist attack on April 22 in the Baisaran Valley near Pahalgam, Jammu and Kashmir, where 5 militants killed 26 civilians in a popular scenic area with minimal security. India accused Pakistan of orchestrating the attack through its intelligence agency, the ISI, citing the agency's links to the terrorist groups Jaish-e-Mohammed and Lashkar-e-Taiba, who are said to be responsible for this and other attacks. Pakistan denied the accusations, calling the allegations baseless and suggesting the attack could have been a false flag operation. Shortly afterwards, missiles, drones and fighter jets were reportedly flying in both directions. Fortunately, after just 4 days, a ceasefire was declared, which was held. However, plenty of damage was done, with India reporting 15 dead civilians and Pakistan citing 31, along with an estimated $84 billion of damage, mostly on the Indian side. The major risk here is that both sides are nuclear armed, don't like each other at all, to put it mildly, and the odds of rapid escalation from a conventional war into a nuclear exchange are very high. The Bulletin of Atomic Scientists estimates that Pakistan possesses around 170 nuclear weapons, while India is estimated to have about 180. Given their geographical locations, the aftermath of even a limited nuclear exchange would be devastating for the entire region, which encompasses around a third of the global population. A 2019 Rutgers study calculated that the famines resulting from a regional nuclear winter would affect millions or even billions. On paper, India has a far larger and more powerful military than Pakistan, ranked 4th globally in military power, while Pakistan ranks 12th. India substantially outpaces Pakistan in terms of manpower, defense budget, equipment, and strategic assets, particularly in air and naval power. India possesses a larger fleet of aircraft, tanks, and naval vessels, including 2 aircraft carriers, compared to Pakistan's naval focus on littoral operations. What that means is that if a full-scale conflict were to erupt, it's likely a question of when, not if, Pakistan is compelled to escalate to nukes to avoid a crushing defeat. The prospect is made even more dire by the complicated web of military partnerships that both nations have. As mentioned earlier, China is Pakistan's primary military provider, and Pakistan also has long-standing and deep military ties with Russia. India's military ties with Russia are even deeper, and it also has long-standing and deep military relationships with the US and various European military powers. So, the potential for a major conflict between India and Pakistan to gradually draw in many of the world's other major powers and spark a global war is uncomfortably high. Now, the next major hotspot most likely to flare up into a major war in the near future is also in Asia and centers on a territorial dispute. However, this time, the British only played a marginal role in the dispute, and the territory in question is not just areas along the border, but the entire territory of one of the possible combatants. We're talking about China versus Taiwan. At the heart of the conflict is a post-World War II legal dispute, although the historical root of the issues between the island and the mainland goes back centuries, if not a couple of millennia. China claims that, legally, Taiwan is Chinese territory under the terms of the Cairo Declaration of 1943 and the Potsdam Declaration of 1945. It argues that these wartime statements, issued by China, the US, and the UK, mandated the return of territories seized by Japan, including Taiwan, following World War II. Beijing further contends that the 1971 UN General Assembly Resolution 2758, which transferred China's seat at the UN from Taipei to Beijing, settled the issue of Taiwan sovereignty, affirming that there is no such thing as two Chinas or one China, one Taiwan. Following Japan's surrender in 1945, the Republic of China, as the nation was known then, assumed administrative control over Taiwan. Then civil war broke out in China between the nationalist government and the Chinese Communist Party. In 1949, the defeated nationalist government retreated to Taiwan, while the communists established the People's Republic of China, or PRC, on the mainland. Since then, although it's never formally declared independence, Taiwan has been governed separately from the PRC, developing its own democratic institutions, military and economy. And as polls have consistently shown, only a small percentage, 10 to 15%, actually favor full reunification with the PRC, while roughly half favor full independence ultimately. However, China has never budged from its position that Taiwan belongs to it and sooner or later will be returned, by force if not voluntarily. Besides its legal and historical claims to the island, there's another pressing reason why China so desperately seeks full control over the island: the deep military ties between Taiwan and the US. The US has been neck-deep in Taiwan since its inception, helping to oversee the transition of Taiwan from Japanese colonial rule to the nationalists in 1949. The US then maintained a substantial military presence, including tens of thousands of American troops on the island until 1979, when it normalized relations with the PRC. Since then, the US has provided over $75 billion in arms sales to Taiwan, with cumulative deliveries spanning decades. These include modernized F-16V fighters, MIM-104 Patriot, and NASAMS air defense systems, M1A2 Abrams tanks, Harpoon missiles, Switchblade 600 drones, and other advanced weaponry. Plus, although it stopped short of a full mutual defense pact, the Taiwan Relations Act commits the US to maintaining the island's ability to defend itself. The US will almost certainly come to its aid. So, China isn't too thrilled about having what it perceives as a major US forward base just 81 miles from its coastline. To be fair, the US hasn't allowed Cuba, which is just 90 miles from Florida, to become the same kind of forward base for Russia or China for precisely the same reason. And the stronger Taiwan becomes militarily, and the more closely embedded it becomes with the US, the more of an incentive there is for China to make its move, and soon. Without the US's direct involvement, a direct clash between China and Taiwan is somewhat of a mismatch. Taiwan's advanced US weaponry does reduce its quantitative disadvantage somewhat, but there's still a pretty serious gulf between them. The PRC has 4 times as many personnel, twice as many artillery pieces, almost 3 times as many aircraft, and a much larger navy with 10 times as many submarines and 3 aircraft carriers to 0, and a much larger array of advanced missiles and drones. That's not to mention its nuclear arsenal. As a result, China should on paper have the resources to blockade and bombard Taiwan into submission before launching an invasion, if that's necessary. However, it's almost inconceivable that if China did attack Taiwan, the US and other allies would just stand idly by and watch. In this scenario, the US wildcard is a double-edged sword. On the one side, the fact that an invasion of Taiwan would likely lead to war with the US is certainly a major factor preventing China from pulling the trigger. On the other hand, if China does make its move, the US's involvement almost certainly ensures a wider, potentially nuclear confrontation. Meanwhile, roughly 1,000 miles north of Taiwan, very similar dynamics are at play in our next major hotspot, the Korean Peninsula, home to North and South Korea. This time, however, it's not just the US that would in all likelihood be drawn in, but the world's other two nuclear superpowers, Russia and China as well. Like the China-Taiwan conflict, the conflict between North and South Korea is also a conflict between people who differ little genetically, but greatly ideologically. At the end of the Korean War, an armistice was signed and a demilitarized zone, or DMZ, was established between them. For 60 years, a fragile peace has held along this 155-mile-long area, where one of the wildest forests in the world, packed with thousands of diverse wildlife species, is ringed by one of the most heavily fortified and defended places on Earth. Thousands of artillery pieces and miles of landmines stand at the ready on both sides, with the 9 million people in the South's capital Seoul within easy range of the North's missiles. Left entirely to their own devices, it would be an interesting, if extremely violent, confrontation between the two sides. On the one side, you'd have the technologically advanced South Koreans, with 600,000 active personnel, making it the fifth largest standing army globally, plus a reserve force of about 3.1 million. They're armed to the teeth with world-class platforms like the domestically produced K2 Black Panther main battle tank and the K9 Thunder self-propelled howitzer, considered best in class globally. Their air force operates over 1,000 aircraft, including advanced F-35A stealth fighters, F-15K Slam Eagles, and FA-50 light fighters. The Navy operates a fleet of more than 200 active hulls, including submarines and amphibious warfare ships, and both have a spread of sophisticated munitions to fire from these platforms. Facing off against them would be the secretive North, whose military capabilities are arguably the least well understood amongst all medium to large-sized military powers. They're believed to have over 1.2 million active personnel and an additional 560,000 in reserve, making North Korea the 34th largest military globally. Although most units were manufactured during the 1950s to 1970s, the ground forces are believed to be equipped with approximately 4,300 tanks, 2,500 armored personnel carriers, 2,000 towed and self-propelled artillery, and 1,500 multiple rocket launchers. Moreover, 70% of North Korea's ground forces and 60% of its naval forces are thought to be permanently deployed south of the Pyongyang-Wonsan line, meaning it could launch a surprise attack at any time. Judging by the frequency and prowess of its increasingly regular tests, the North also has a substantial arsenal of missiles, which are growing rapidly both in number and quality. That includes successful tests of hypersonic missiles with maneuverable warheads. Most alarmingly, North Korea is believed to have up to 60 nuclear warheads and enough fissile material for over 100 nuclear weapons, with some projections suggesting it could have up to 200 by 2027. It's also tested more than 100 ballistic missiles capable of carrying nuclear warheads, including short, medium, intermediate, and intercontinental range missiles, as well as submarine launch variants. Plus, it's believed to have vast stockpiles of chemical and biological weapons, which could be attached to any or all of the above-mentioned missiles, or even stuffed into artillery shells. With all of that firepower packed into an area roughly the size of Minnesota or the UK, the potential for a conflict between the two powers to get very messy very quickly is immense. Plus, there's a small matter of deep military partnerships with other nuclear powers on both sides to add to the mix. North Korea has had a mutual defense pact with China since 1961 that obliges each party to come to the other's aid in the event of an attack on either. As of 2024, North Korea now has a similar pact in place with Russia and has demonstrated its willingness to uphold its side of the bargain by sending thousands of troops to help Russia fight off Ukraine's incursion into Russia's Kursk region. Likewise, South Korea enjoys the protection of the 1953 Mutual Defense Treaty, through which the US commits to defending South Korea against armed attacks including those involving nuclear threats from North Korea. The US withdrew its tactical nuclear weapons from the Korean Peninsula in 1991. However, in terms of the treaty, the South remains fully covered by the US nuclear shield, also known as the nuclear umbrella or extended deterrence. Over and above the nuclear shield, the US maintains multiple bases in South Korea, housing around 28,000 troops. So, it's almost inconceivable that any substantial clash on the peninsula doesn't end up drawing in all the other major powers sooner or later. And the scariest part about any clash between any of the world's major powers is that all of them, including the US, have finite inventories of all of their conventional weapons, which are likely to be insufficient to secure total victory. That means the longer such a conflict goes on, the closer nuclear war creeps in. Fortunately, underneath the belligerent bluster on both sides, for now, there seems to be little appetite on either side for full-scale confrontation. South Korea is one of the most vibrant advanced economies in the world and can seriously do without being devastated by a major war. By contrast, the vast majority of North Koreans are thought to live in agrarian poverty. The big risk has always been that North Korea's dictator for life, Kim Jong-un, falls under such serious economic pressure that war becomes an enticing option. However, growing trade with Russia, subsequent to the strategic partnership signed last year, in addition to improving relations with China, seem to have eased the domestic pressures on Kim somewhat. And the more stable things are domestically, the better a mood Kim will be in, and the lower the chances of war. Now, we'll briefly mention one last potential conflict that many believe may well kick off in 2026. Russia invading one or more of the Baltic states. Since all three of Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania are NATO members, an attack by Russia on any of them would trigger NATO's Article 5, likely drawing the entire bloc into the conflict immediately. The risks to Europe of such a clash speak for themselves. But frankly, Russia has its hands more than full in Ukraine in 2026, with no free resources or attention to launch another invasion in a totally different part of the country, especially if its economy is really on the verge of collapse, as many believe. Unless Russia is provoked, particularly in the enclave of Kaliningrad, it's unlikely that a strained Russia would attempt such a thing with war raging in Ukraine. Hopefully, calm heads prevail in all the regions we've mentioned, so that when the time comes next year to make our list of the 5 most likely conflicts to spark a global war in 2027, we're still only talking about the potential and not the reality of a major conflict in all of them. We'll of course be following these and all the other most important conflicts closely here on The Military Show, so make sure you subscribe to stay fully informed. Thanks for watching.